So there's equity and there's debt. And if things go really well, all the action is in the equity. But if things go sour and the company goes belly up, then all the action is in the debt. And I have to admit, I've always been a little bit of a distressed debt and debt restructuring buff. After the financial crisis, I followed all the debt to equity swaps, all the private equity sponsored loan restructurings. So I'm really excited to have Professor Adam Badawi here today with me from Berkeley Law.
Thanks for having me.
To talk about his recent working paper, which is co-authored with Elisabeth de Fontenay from Duke Law, Contractual Complexity in Debt Agreements, the Case of EBITDA. Accounting figures and bond offerings often seem like a very dry matter. But as Adam Newman and WeWork has taught us with their bond offering last year and with their community-adjusted EBITDA figure, there's also a lot of room for creativity in accounting. And this is exactly what this paper is all about. So let's dig right in. Okay, so Adam, thank you so much for being with us today. You gave a great presentation this afternoon, and I sort of put you on the spot, asking you to come on our video series. So thanks a lot for doing this. So your presentation really struck a chord with me because it's about the accounting and legal notion of EBITDA, which I think is something that has not been discussed in the literature so far. And of course, we had this flamboyant example of the community-adjusted EBITDA in the WeWork case that was all over the press. And maybe before we jump into the paper and into the whole discussion, maybe give us some background. Who are you, and how did you stumble across this topic of all topics?
Sure. So I'm a professor of law at UC Berkeley. I've been there for a little over 2 years, and I was at WashU in St. Louis before that. I began my scholarly career more as someone who focused on commercial law and contracts rather than kind of what I would now call law and finance. Although I view them as quite similar because I'm interested in the content of contracts, how lawyers produce the content of contracts, and it turns out that a lot of the best data is in the corporate area. So for the last couple of years, a lot of my work is focused on debt, lawyers, contracts, text analysis, and things of that nature. When it comes to this paper, I'm working with my co-author, Elisabeth de Fontenay, who's at Duke, and she was a debt lawyer for many years, and someone who's very insightful about those issues. And she said, listen, when I worked on these contracts and when I talk to lawyers, they say we spend all this time negotiating what the definition of income is, even though kind of if you talk to someone who does corporate finance, they would say, well, EBITDA is EBITDA, right? It's just a very basic measure of income, kind of earnings before income, taxation, depreciation, and amortization. It is what it is. And it didn't take us very long before we were convinced that there was something there because we looked across a handful of agreements and saw extremely wide variation in the way this income gets defined. And when we expanded the universe of contracts that we were looking to over 4,000, we continue to see even more variation. And so we were really interested as to why that happens, what are the consequences, what is that related to, and it also, we think it's important for the people who work in the finance and the accounting literatures to understand that the way lawyers draft these things have real consequences for the way they do research, because you can't just say income is income. Income is the way income is defined.
But maybe let's take a little bit of a step back first and give the audience a little bit of a broader overview what we're talking about here.
Sure.
So the paper is about debt covenants in syndicated loans. So let me break this apart a little bit. Syndicated loans, these are loans that are issued by multiple banks, often resold to some of those much feared CLO vehicles, right?
Sure, yeah.
And debt covenants, they can come in many forms. So what are the most common debt covenants that you've come across?
Sure. So in these syndicated loans, there's tension between the lenders and the stockholders, right? And this tension becomes particularly intense when companies get into distress, because lenders want to make sure that money is staying inside the firm, and stockholders want the money to go outside the firm to them, or for the firm to start making big bets. And so the way lenders protect their interests in these syndicated loans is to put covenants in them. And these covenants are basically ways of providing a quarterly checkup on the health of the company. And so the maintenance covenants will specify a certain financial metric. It could be something like net worth. It could be something like debt to EBITDA. It could be something like interest coverage ratio. And these are essentially numbers that are written into the contract. And it says, look, every quarter you have to report what is your net worth? What is your debt to EBITDA ratio? What is your interest coverage ratio? And if you're, depending on what it is, if you're above or below, you're in violation of the covenant. And that gives the lenders very strong rights to essentially accelerate the loan. Kind of all the money is due today, which a company that is in distress cannot do. Usually this leads to renegotiation, but it's a bad thing for a borrower to have tripped one of these covenants. And these are, these loan agreements are hundreds of pages long, and a lot of the content of them is both the debt covenants themselves, as well as the definitions of the components that go into the debt covenants.
So let's dig a little deeper into EBITDA. If you're a credit analyst and you want to look at the figure that you can manipulate the least, then you would start probably at the top of the income statement with gross revenue. EBITDA, the figure that you really drill into, it's not at the bottom, it's not net income, but it's in between.
Yes.
And so maybe break it apart a little bit for us so that we understand what this is all about.
Sure. So I think in a big picture sense, what lenders really care about is the ability of the company to pay back the loan, right? What they want is the operational health of the company. And whatever business you're in, it should be generating income of some sort. You have certain costs, and they want to essentially see, is that staying level? Is that going up? Is that going down? And that's a hard thing to measure, right? There's no kind of perfect measure. So gross revenues, you're correct, that's hard to manipulate because the money that comes in is the money that comes in. But then you've got a bunch of costs to try and figure out kind of how profitable you are. And that's where things begin to get quite complicated. You have cash expenses, things like payroll, things like cost of goods, things of that nature, but there are also non-cash expenses, things like depreciation, amortization, and then there's certain expenses that you care about, but they're not necessarily related to operational health, like interest expense or taxes, right? Those have really no bearing to the health of the company. That could just be a matter of kind of what tax jurisdiction you happen to be in, or your what your previous capital structure was. So EBITDA is conventionally seen as kind of the quickest, easiest way to get at that measure. But I think most people recognize that it's not perfect. It's manipulable, and but it is the best of kind of getting at the ability to repay debt.
And this is exactly where your paper comes in, looking at the various ways in which EBITDA can be adjusted in debt contracts. So walk us through some of the ways that EBITDA can be adjusted in these syndicated loans.
Sure. So some of these loans define EBITDA in the same way you would if you took an accounting class or a corporate finance class and they taught you just what the acronym means. Some of the contracts are just that simple. The definition is 20 words long, and it's what we expect it to be. We also find some definitions that are longer than 2,000 words, right? And we also, I think the average is something like 300 or 400. And when they're stretching beyond what is the conventional definition of EBITDA, they're finding ways to add income back into EBITDA, right? And they do that, and sometimes things make sense. Like, so for example, if you have non-cash expenses, right? So, and sometimes that might be related to the issuance of stock options to employees, right? So you have to expense that, but that's not actually money that's going out the door. So in that sense, it makes sense to kind of say, okay, that wasn't really money that you lost. But other times we see things that are much more manipulable. Like, so for example, if you had an extraordinary cash expense, well, what's extraordinary, right? It could be, we need to make sure that this was extraordinary because we need to add income, because if we don't add income, we're going to trip our covenant and be in a bunch of trouble. So there's some reasons that make sense or that seem well reasoned for expanding the definition because you're trying to capture that operational health. And there are some reasons that seem that they give borrowers quite a bit of ability to manipulate the income in a way that's going to keep them from tripping a covenant.
In your paper, you take a step further and you collect a vast amount of data on, I think it's 4,000 individual debt contracts.
Yes.
And you really drill into these ways in which EBITDA can be manipulated. Where's the data from, and what was the goal?
Sure. So we have the fortune for public companies that are traded on markets in the U.S. They have to publicly file all material documents, they have to publicly release all material information. And so if you have a loan of several $100 million, that's material, and so they will disclose that contract. And then there's a data source called Practical Law that kind of compiles that information. Also provides a link to the agreement, so we're able to scrape all those agreements off of EDGAR, which is the public filing system in the United States, and then we have to do kind of the hard, unglamorous work of cleaning all the data and writing code that extracts the EBITDA definition, and then we have to check that it's the correct EBITDA. There's, sometimes you have adjusted EBITDA and consolidated and adjusted EBITDA. So we have to do some work to make sure that we're getting the one that ultimately matters for the debt covenants or for the maintenance covenants in the agreement. But you're right, we have over 4,000 of these definitions, and we have a lot more information about the firms as well.
And then you construct this index, which consists out of 8 different ways in which EBITDA can be adjusted. So how did you come up with this index?
So my co-author on this project was a debt lawyer for several years. So she has a lot of familiarity with this. And it was also through just reading through about 10% of the sample. We saw a lot of standardization of the add backs. So we came up with I think it's probably 6 of the most common add backs, and then we also have an additional category for miscellaneous add backs. And essentially, we create an index where for every add back to income that you have, we increase the index by 1. So you start at 1 if you have the regular definition, and it goes all the way up to 8 if you have every single add back. And so we see quite a wide distribution across all the definitions. Most of them have an index value of 2 or 3, maybe 4, while some have 7 or 8. Some have 1. So we see the distribution is weighted towards the low end, but we see quite a bit in every category.
No, that was really fascinating to me. And I mean, having worked in distressed debt restructuring, I know there's a lot of variability between syndicated loan contracts. Coming to the results now that I found particularly fascinating was you have a differentiation between sponsored loans and non-sponsored loans, meaning private equity sponsored syndicated loans. And there you find that these are higher ranked according to the index. Walk us through these results.
Sure. So we know when the loans have private equity sponsors. And so there's other research showing that private equity groups or private equity sponsored loans often tend to get better terms than people who are not private equity sponsored. And there's a variety of reasons why that might be the case. It might be, as you're suggesting, well, they're equity holders, so they're the ones who are in conflict with the creditors, so they want to bargain hard. There are also other accounts that they're repeat players, so the banks don't want to lose their business. So if they insist on certain terms, they might be more willing to go along with that. It could be that they're more experienced in terms of the ability to negotiate. It's hard for us to identify exactly why, but the results we find, which are private equity sponsored loans get more permissive definitions of income, is consistent with the other research that shows that this is a consistent pattern.
And another result I noticed was that the high yield or junk bonds, they also tend to have less restrictive covenant.
They tend to, the high yield actually has more permissive definitions of income.
Yeah.
But I think what this is because these are also often secured
Mm-hmm.
loans. So we also find that if you're, in some sense, at first blush, it might seem a little bit odd that secured loans, which are seen as a little bit safer
Mm-hmm.
because there's assets behind them, are you get more permissive income. But in some sense, it could be a concession, right? Kind of, look, you've given us assets as security. If you want more flexibility on income, we're willing to give that to you. Those loans also tend to be more speculative. So I think there's a relationship between all of those things. But we can't precisely identify that relationship. It's just an association that we can show. But it's an account that I think makes sense.
And maybe the last point was the covenant slack that you looked at. So under covenant slack, maybe walk us a little bit. What do you mean by covenant slack, and what are the results?
Sure. So there's a pretty significant literature in finance on covenant slack, and basically what covenant slack is a measure of the difference between the threshold that is set in the debt agreement. So it could say your net worth has to be at least $1 billion. And if your net worth falls below $1 billion, you've tripped the covenant, we can accelerate the loan. Well, if your net worth is $1.01 billion, you do not have a lot of room to maneuver. So we would call that tight covenant slack. Whereas if your net worth is $1.5 billion, you do have a lot of room to maneuver. So that would be loose covenant slack. So what we find in our paper is that there's an inverse relationship between income permissiveness and covenant slack. So if the banks or if the parties agree to a permissive definition of income, you're going to have tight slack, right? Because we know that you might be able to play games a little bit, and so we need to tighten the slack to somehow make up for that. Whereas if the definition of income is very tight, we see more covenant slack, right? And so I view these as substitutes, right? The bank says, look, we'll give you one or the other, and in that sense, you can choose between them.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me that in the negotiations they basically say, okay, we're gonna be hard on the EBITDA either or on the.
And we also find that you have to pay for it, right? Or at least there's a positive association between the loan spread, which is to say the interest rate you're paying on the loan, and the permissiveness of the income. If you want more flexibility to define your income, your loan spread is going to be a little bit higher, which I think, again, makes sense. Kind of we're giving you something that you want. You've got to give us something that we want, namely a higher interest.
Absolutely. So Adam, thank you so much for being with us here today and for doing this very spontaneously, this very spontaneous session. I'm really excited about this topic in particular. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.